Hi, and welcome to the Land Pioneers podcast, where we speak with some of the leading minds shaping the future of land development and urban planning. So each episode, we uncover the insights, experiences, and lessons behind the people driving real change in our industry. And today I'm joined by Shannon Hill. Shannon, welcome.
Hi, thanks very much for having me today, Stan.
Sure thing. So Shannon is a highly accomplished urban planner with over 2 decades of experience shaping communities across both Australia and the United States. She's currently the principal planner at Urban Design and Management Group in Melbourne, where she leads a diverse range of projects from greenfield residential developments through to broader strategic growth opportunities. Earlier in her career, Shannon spent close to a decade with SMEC Urban and then had also worked over in New York with Landmark West, where she led a program focused on cities' history, architecture, and planning. With ongoing changes shaping Victoria's greenfield landscape, I wanted today's conversation to really explore opportunities and challenges of what's ahead and what developers need to be thinking about as the planning environment continues to evolve. But before we get started, just briefly a little bit about Eagle Vision. We're the sponsors of the Land Pioneers podcast, and we've been involved in 3D visualization for nearly 18 years and with over 745 projects, including large-scale land estates, major precincts, and greenfield communities across Australia. Large-scale building and development teams often work with us because our visuals are built to support big-picture master plan decisions, interactive master plans, precinct frameworks, and effective marketing collateral to communicate functional elements of proposed land communities, not just creating pretty pictures. With teams in Australia and Europe, work continues around the clock to keep large, complex projects moving along. And we're always very open in how we work, giving builders and developers clear visibility over progress and detail with no surprises. That clarity and reliability are why Eagle Vision is trusted on complex, large-scale subdivision projects. And now back to our guest, Associate Director of Urban Management and Design Group, Shannon Hill. So, Shannon, I'd love for you to share a little bit about your journey and how you got into planning.
Sure. I think, like most planners, I love maps. From an early age, I sort of love that intersection of maps and architecture and buildings. I certainly explored doing architecture, and then I realised I had to do physics at university, and I did not want to be doing physics. So we veered more into the design aspect of it, and planning for me brings together the elements of policy, strategic planning, and implementation as well. So it's really the intersection there. My initial work was involved actually in regional councils. I always had a real thought process that the issues that you got to deal with in regional Victoria were a lot broader than Metro Melbourne. For example, you get to deal with small towns, heritage, architecture, a whole different range of actual issues on a daily basis. You also get to, you're in a pretty small team too, right? So you get to have a different level of exposure, much higher level of exposure. So that's where I started. I started my first jobs out in Mirrabulshire. What is Mirrabulshire now? I was a student planner, peri-urban, edge of Melbourne now, and it's a much busier place than it was at the time. When I first started, and this is probably showing my age a little bit, but some of your audience will be familiar with Victoria's planning scheme maps at that time. You actually had to colour them in. So none of this digital type stuff that we have today. So that's always used to colour in the maps for planning scheme zones and overlays and have little bits cut out and stuck on. That was a really great grounding for me. I was in a great team where, again, with a small team, you have to know how things work, how legislation works. It's really hands-on, and I really loved that. So I did a few years with regional planning, moved around to a couple of different places. Before coming back, it was actually just a shift with my partner at the time to Melbourne, and switched to the dark side, as they would say, back to private consultancy. And that's really where I got into growth area planning. So that was a big consultancy. You saw the whole range of project delivery from the very start, due diligence planning, all the way through to project delivery. And I love that. It's great as a planner to be able to see a project start and finish. And as I think, I'll probably touch on through our conversation today, Stan, they're really long project timelines. And so it's really rewarding to see something actually be delivered and be built, because not all projects do. So from that evolved into SMEC Urban, where it was a lot about that growth area planning, working with a lot of big residential clients, and really learning the ropes of project management. From there, I went on to urban design and management, where it was a much more client interfacing role, and it's a much smaller company as well. The benefit of that, in my view, and it still is today, is that you're working very closely with everyone in your team. So I work on a daily basis with my planning team, my urban design team, the project managers, the people that design, the people that build, and we all have to work together. It's a very highly collaborative environment, and that's one of the things that I really do love about it. So I got a lot more involved at that point in project management and client work as well, really that client interface, learning to guide your clients and provide recommendations, and the clarity that they're looking for is a skill that you develop over time as well. From there, we had the opportunity to move to the US, which we were meant to go for 2 years, and we went for 5, or over 5 in the end. And it was a really formative experience, just professionally and personally. I think for me personally, living in the middle of New York, in a dense city, in an apartment. I lived with my family, my kids, in an apartment. They went to the local school. It really, for me, professionally reminded me of how important it is to have really great public spaces. I lived a couple of blocks from Central Park, a couple of blocks from Riverside Park, but also New York's full of little pocket parks. They do some things really well. They have really wide sidewalks. It taught me about the importance of having good public transport and having a walkable neighbourhood. So as a planner, I have photo reels full of what other people would think would be really mundane things. Oh, look at that tree, that sort of stuff. Look at how that space comes together. I think New York does a lot of that really well. And I recognise, obviously, we always used to talk about New York almost being a bit of a different part of America. It's unique in its own right. But we did get the opportunity to do a lot of travel there as well, and some of those examples you do see, stay with me today, certainly formed my view on different things as I've come back over the past few years. So while in New York, I actually ended up working for a local nonprofit. You mentioned it before, Landmark West, and they talk a lot about the history of place and architecture. And my role there was glorious. I loved my role there. To go into local schools and to teach kids in a public school environment about architecture, planning, places, how these spaces interact, and tie it as well to the curriculum that they're working. So I was very blessed to be able to spend my days literally walking around the streets of the Upper West Side of New York, drawing buildings and learning about cornices and why do you have stoops and all these sort of really fabulous ideas, which we then turned into some much broader projects that they're still working on today. A lot about history of place in New York as well. I'd love to be able to do that job here. I'm just not sure we quite have the system that would enable it. But you never know. If someone wants to, let me be interested, I'd be very interested in doing that. It's glorious teaching kids about these fun things like that. We came back from New York in 2021, and I rejoined urban design management. So that phase was a lot about reestablishing, right? Reconnecting. You've been out of the game for 5 years. A lot of familiar faces, but a lot changed as well. People changed, and the Victorian planning system had changed a lot as well. So just recently become an associate director in that team as well, which is super exciting. And now it's about growing a business, growing people, working out where we want to go as a business as well. And I think it's culminated really nicely with a lot of change in the planning system and in Victoria, and also a lot of change, I think, in just the built environment as well. So it's exciting times ahead, I think.
Nice. So I'm curious, with your experience in New York and seeing the real sort of stuff that's happening there, are they ahead of us in terms of their planning thinking and spaces and how they're handling maybe that urban sprawl and expansion of cities?
Yeah. I think that certainly within a city environment, the things that stick with me around New York are the little details, literally the width of sidewalks. I always find here you've got a metre and a half if you're lucky. They have really expansive sidewalks, particularly in their retail areas. They do a lot of the detailed streetscape planting that's really human scale, and I think also adds to that amenity of a space. It becomes more walkable if it's easy, if it looks nice, if you've got shade. Shade is amazing. One of the real things that I loved to do in New York as well is ride their bike share system. They've gotten so much better at that now. They're not the Netherlands. They're not Paris, which is also doing amazing things, and even London, which is also doing amazing things in that space now. But they're certainly much more focused now on reducing. Instead of having a 5-lane road in the middle of the city, they now have 3 lanes with actually a protected bike lane. So I think they are much more progressive. In parts of New York, this wouldn't be, a general comment about the US. There would be other parts of the US that are quite the opposite. Having said that, some of the things that always amused me about New York was that on-street parking is free. That seems like a fairly crazy idea.
In the middle of Manhattan.
Yeah, in the middle of Manhattan. So,
wow.
Having said
Imagine that on Collins Street, right?
I know, right. Yeah, exactly. And that was effectively what it was. Look, we didn't have a car in New York, so it never affected me, but we did take advantage of, their open spaces and having seating, just the real little details. In terms of planning, they have quite a different system to what we do. It's much more of a building code focused system. But even to learn about those processes was super interesting. I did get can I get the acronym right? American Institute of Certified Planners certification, and that was really hard. But I was very proud of myself for doing it and the study that had to go into it. And some of those things that you do still bring back, it's that continued professional development in my mind as well. So lots of detail I take from New York that I think is really important that we perhaps don't always do.
Interesting.
As well here.
So to summarize, activity centres having wider sidewalks creates better amenity.
Yeah, and they're very good as well at having those active interfaces, active frontages as well.
Yep. So lower fences or completely no fences.
Even just having, instead of having just big blank walls and having an internalised system, again, you've got windows to the street and you've got that activity. We used to regularly get the subway very late at night, never once had an issue. And It's about that the number of people that are still out and about, that environment that it creates, that safety aspect. It was never a concern for us. I'll take all of that. We also lived in an area of New York that was pretty privileged in that regard. So others' experiences would be quite different. But certainly when I reflect on that time there, I'll never forget one where I actually came back and was back in Australia, and I was asked to work on an apartment project, and I was probably overly critical on apartment design, having then lived in apartments with my family. And I don't think Australia, we don't do family apartments particularly well at this point in time. A lot of that market seems to still be very geared towards the single person or a couple versus obviously, particularly New York, everyone lives in an apartment. So in my view, there's still that real stigma associated with a family living in an apartment in Melbourne. That's my experience here.
Yeah. Well, the aspiration is always to have a little bit of land and a little bit of freestanding.
And that's what we've been sold, right. And certainly lots of Americans love that idea too.
Sure. But they just wouldn't happen in New York.
No, absolutely not. One of the densest places in the world, and certainly where I was on the Upper West Side, certainly one of the densest neighbourhoods in the US, full stop.
Yeah,
and with that comes good things and bad things, but our general overview was extremely positive, and I do take away a lot of those experiences when talking to my clients here when they do have those sort of concerns. Simple things like waste collection, which New York does terribly until quite recently. But there's always room for improvement.
Interesting. All right, so let's change gears and come back down to what's happening locally. So Victorian planning has come a long way over the last, 20 years or plus, and has had to deal with some pretty major population changes. So how do you see, I suppose, some of the more visionary initiatives in the latest policy statement? What is coming through for you?
You're right that Victoria's a really long history of good strategic planning. I remember I did my major university project on the MMBW 1950s plan. So there's the Metropolitan Melbourne Board of Works, and they had a plan about how they would create green spaces. So we go way back. There are a couple of real great ones that the Kennett government did in the 90s around the Donut City, and also actually then the postcode 3000 project, I think it was, about bringing people back into the city. And we're really seeing the fruition of those now. And they were in the 90s. It takes, planning is a long-term front. You then had Plan Melbourne for a long time, and now we've got Plan for Victoria, which was last year's big initiative, coupled with the Victorian Housing Statement. So what both of those have done over the past 18 months, transformative changes in the Victorian planning system. And I think any planner or a lot of people are just in the industry in general, most changes we've ever seen. There were periods last year where it was every other week there was something new coming up. And to be honest, it was hard to keep up, and I probably haven't kept up in some spaces. It depends what you do on a day-to-day basis.
Things are changing so quick.
Yeah, exactly. And I think only now, as things have started to slow and there's been some actual conversations within the industry, that we begin to unpick a lot of that. How do you do these things? So coupled last year with the housing statement, so the main sort of theme out of that was the government's objective to deliver 800,000 new homes in a decade across Victoria. So
a feat that has never been achieved before.
Never been achieved before. There was a little bit of clarification from the government shortly after this announcement that that's the planning for 800,000 new homes. So at least in theory, we don't need to deliver because, you're right. Otherwise, that's 80,000 homes a year. Who's building those? So for a planning system, it needs to be able to accommodate that. So that's kind of happening in a few different ways. We have a lot of activity centre work going on at the minute, which has always been activity centres. I know Sydney in particular has always been quite activity centre focused, probably less so more recently in Melbourne until the past probably couple of years. We now have 60 designated activity centres in the system. 10 of those are the big ones, so they're meant to deliver 60,000 new homes over that period. Whole lot of issues that come up out of that, which I'm sure we'll chat about as we talk. In terms of how that's all come together, I think it's pretty ambitious, right? You've got a state government who, planning is politics too, that has come out and said, in some face of some opposition, that we are going to be putting increased housing, a lot of housing in the middle rings of Melbourne, which traditionally have not had single detached dwellings. This morning I heard that they've started to put some sort of tower height limits for some of these areas. So we're thinking like Brighton and Oakley and some of these really middle ring Melbourne, 20-storey towers. So you can probably imagine the reaction that gets from your local community. But the government has come in and basically cleared the path and streamlined the planning systems. And I'm oversimplifying, of course, it's never going to be quite this simple, but put together the framework to enable that development to deliver housing. So that's their key driver right now. I think coupled with that, we've seen as well changes, sort of, I term it in that climate resilience space, urban heat policies, tree canopy policies, sustainability, really strengthening some aspects of those. There's been a bit of criticism about the sustainability aspect, and it's been stripped out of some areas and maybe not quite replaced. But it does present an interesting juxtaposition, some of those policies and how we actually balance and deliver is where those conversations are going now. Once the dust has settled a little bit and we can kind of start to understand what it means.
Look, it's going to be interesting, especially some of the aspects of these policies that may conflict with each other and may not necessarily drive feasibility yield, but from a future strategic perspective may be a better outcome, right?
Yeah, that's very true. And I think there's, sort of in my day-to-day work there, the questions and comments that we're kind of finding that we're actually having to bring forward in our due diligence planning and advice that we provide to clients. And the one that particularly sticks out is the tree canopy cover. So to get into the real nitty-gritty of what I'm doing on a day-to-day basis. So there were changes. Okay, so one of the means of implementing this Victorian housing target is through their low-rise and townhouse code guidelines. So that's really applying to what we normally call our dual-oc type situation, up to 4-storey buildings. So you might get some, 6-pack, 3-storey type development in there as well. One of the deemed to comply provisions is, say, for example, I have a lot that's 1,500 square metres in area. I actually need to provide 20% of my site as tree canopy. That's really quite hard. So council has some discretion to the 20%. They might be quite happy with not accepting the 20%, but certainly our experience to date so far is no, well, that's the guideline. That's what we're going to stick to unless you've really got some extenuating site circumstances. So the tree canopy is going towards reducing our urban heat, island issues. It's about sustainability. There's a whole lot of really great sustainable reasons why we do this. And you're right around their long-term goals. How we then balance that with also providing housing yields that developers can actually financially deliver is the real challenge at the minute. So I think some of the teething problems around that we're just going to have to work through. There's going to be some really innovative design solutions that come out of this. I think that's really exciting.
Is it about materials or?
It can sometimes be. It's, I think, as much about instead of perhaps just putting your fairly standard housing product or footprint, which with that, and I don't want to look down on that product because it's often well tested, it's well liked by the market, and it's probably something that can be constructed from an affordability perspective as well. But you might have to get a bit more bespoke, and so with that comes additional costs. So it's going to be that real balancing act of what can we do, and it's also really driving having to drive some really good landscape design responses, which has been a challenge for the industry. You have some really great landscape architecture firms that are completely all over this. They're doing some fabulous work, but bringing everyone else along who might not necessarily be in that space, from a consultant perspective, that's been challenging work. The goalposts have shifted quite dramatically. We need to move with it.
Yeah.
And
so,
sorry, go on.
Well, what I'm curious is along the way, so planning perspective, and then you're dealing with infrastructure levies, and then you've got authorities like Melbourne Water. How are they kind of impacting development timeframes?
Yeah, infrastructure levies, there's a lot to unpack in that question as well. Certainly, I think from those sort of middle ring development, the infrastructure levy stuff is probably still a little bit unknown. In a growth area planning sense, we've got some slightly different targets from a tree canopy perspective, which are also going to be challenging, but they're different. We can plan around them in terms of 30% providing in open space. You can generally accommodate that. Though, again, that can have yield implications too, right? If I'm having to provide more spaces in my streets for trees, which again is a good outcome, it does affect your yield. That's just how it works. But the infrastructure levy system in the growth areas in Melbourne is well established now. So we have our growth area planning process is our precinct structure plan process, or a PSP process, as we would typically acronym it down. We like a good acronym, planners. Running with that is infrastructure contributions plan. So we have an ICP and a PSP. So the ICP they're relatively new. They're very long documents, but basically will set those charges. Part of those charges is a state standard charge. I think it sits at about $250,000 per net developable hectare at the minute. And that should, in theory, cover everything you standard need for development, apart from your developer stuff. So this is covering more of that main road, school sites, local parks. You've then still got your developer works, right? Your local streets, that sort of stuff. If that sort of standard levy is not going to cover all the infrastructure, then you get to have a supplementary levy as well. And this is where it gets super interesting. So when the first PSP sort of came out, and I was just working on one yesterday, about 2015, that total levy amount was about $160,000 per net developable hectare. The ones coming out today are sitting north of $500,000. So this is where a lot of my clients they're grappling with this issue, right? That's a fair jump, and that flows through to the land price. On top of those, you have your growth areas infrastructure charge, or your GAIC, which is to fund that state level infrastructure. So your major arterial roads is the one that comes from public transport, those sorts of things. We then have authority charges. So you mentioned Melbourne Water. They have a drainage services scheme. You then have what they call a Melbourne Strategic Assessment Levy as well, which is native vegetation. So all of these things kind of coupled together. It's my job to make sure you know about them all and go in fairly eyes wide open. So that's where that due diligence phase actually becomes really important. And look, most people working in growth areas will be across all of that information. But it does ultimately impact on the end land price. It also then drives you to have to increase your yield, which is a good thing. There are good things. We talked about New York before. That drives those sort of walkable catchment outcomes. It improves communities. I think these are good things. But then on the other hand, I'm also having to balance now 30% tree canopy cover. So we're going to have to get good at our urban design, right, to try and achieve all these policies. And I think most developers as well, and certainly as a planner, those infrastructure levy charges are there for a reason too, right? They do good. They fund that development. I think the issue that a lot of us have at the minute is the timing of that delivery of that development, particularly the GAIC, the state level stuff. And that becomes, a real pinch point for communities. If you've got new communities that have been developed and then they're somewhat isolated because they don't have their new interchange to the freeway or the new train line, whichever, that becomes a real issue for those communities. And even though that's a state level issue, it's the local government level that deals with that. As a consequence, local governments get real sensitive about those issues. They deal at the coalface. It's their people that are complaining to them. So they then get quite sensitive, and it's my job to walk that really tight line between everybody and try and get something done. Sometimes you do it, sometimes you don't.
Yeah, interesting. So in a short space of time, reasonably, the levies have gone from 106,000, you said, per developable hectare, 160, to over 500.
Yeah.
Which means to a developer that their profit margins are shrinking.
Yeah.
Which means that they have to be thinking extra hard about how to make a development profitable.
Yep.
Right. In the past,
yeah, that's exactly right.
In the past, they used to be able to de-risk a site.
Yeah.
By leaving a parcel of land, maybe for medium density development or maybe for a commercial aspect. From a planning perspective, is there anything that's now sort of able to do to help developers achieve that?
Yeah, I think that the de-risking aspect in a growth area is pretty well done through the PSP process. It's actually really good at doing that. Taking a little backward step, I think one of the reasons it is good at doing it is that because it takes so long. But to do a PSP, the amount of technical work that goes into the background reporting of those will be generally sufficient to flag an issue and for the strategic planning process to manage that. A PSP will also very clearly identify what land is to be used for your activity centre, your industrial, your residential. So there's a fair level of certainty in this for the end user, which is great. I think the issues that come up with, more recently that have come up with the PSP issues, as we've gotten more advanced in dealing with them, they generally don't always resolve our drainage issues, which can generally tie back to Melbourne Water and their own processes and requirements changing over time as well. As they've gotten more savvy around how do we manage waterways. I think typically we used to just assume we could reconstruct a waterway and move it over here. Well, we don't do that anymore. That's not very site responsive. So how do we manage that? So drainage is often one of those issues that can still leave you with a bit of risk. Cultural heritage is the other one. So I think one thing that certainly I'm very proud of when I read Victoria's planning documents is the centering of cultural heritage in those documents. They're upfront. They're one of the pillars in Plan Victoria. I think they've done a really great job in how they do it and approach it. There's a lot of care for country and planning for country going on. Cultural heritage at a PSP level is so high level, you don't know what's underneath until you get down to the site-specific level. And there are a couple of instances we're certainly aware of where the end cultural heritage issues have derailed projects in a PSP area. So there's your risk. There's only so much you can do with that. They're even if they are solvable, and I think most issues are solvable, but it's either an impact on your net developable area, so your yield, or it's a fairly significant salvage and processing cost, millions of dollars in some cases. So from a development industry perspective, that's a big issue. It's a big issue.
Yeah.
I don't know how we get around that, to be quite honest. It's one of those things that we obviously need to take the time and effort to care about and deal with properly. Maybe the processing the streamline could be a bit of a streamlined process. So I think in terms of de-risking, the PSP in growth areas does a really great job. In an established area, you don't have that same framework, right? So you're just at a permit stage, de-risking. It can be a bit trickier almost, and you're suddenly dealing with things like built form requirements and design controls and third-party people.
That's right. So, and VCAT.
VCAT. And a lot of the changes that the state government are making are to streamline that process such that you don't have VCAT. Sure. So they're trying, I guess,
streamline the process.
Streamline it and provide more certainty for that end user.
Interesting.
For the developer to actually build, which I think is an interesting proposition in that it kind of assumes that planning is the red tape that stops development. I don't think that's really the case at all. It's a whole gamut of issues. I think there's a lot of planning approvals that sit in the system, probably Australia-wide, I imagine, that simply don't get built for a whole lot of other reasons.
Yeah, exactly.
So planning will do what we can do.
Yeah, sure. Fair enough. And so you've touched on infill sites. There's often quite large infill sites that almost can become communities, like maybe a quarry or some, a sloping land site of some sort. How do you find planning, I suppose, challenges with developing sites of that sort of nature?
Yeah, there's certainly a few good quarry sites around Melbourne that have been developed into really distinctive, beautiful places. There's a couple of defence sites, certainly located in great locations, that have been sort of flagged for a number of years as having to be developed or in great locations to be developed. They're hard. So some of the issues that often come up, site contamination is always the big one. How do you manage site contamination? It's expensive. And the solutions that we probably used to have probably are no longer perhaps palatable. That's a risk. That's the big issue generally. In terms of part of the reason as well as they're so distinctive is they do have that slope, which is a very attractive type proposition, but does require a very nuanced urban design response. We've moved a long way from just levelling those sites out, right? Levelling the sites out has a whole lot of excessive cut and fill you have big retaining walls. You go and have a look at those sort of developments that happened probably 10, 15, 20 years ago, and probably not the best looking sites. So you move now towards working with the land. So you might have certainly larger lots to cope with slope. That can be either way. It can be depth or it can be width. Your subdivision design works with the land. Your roads work with the land, with the fall of the land would be a better option. But you're also then tending to get out of the volume builder market because suddenly you're needing a site responsive building.
Absolutely.
You need a split level. There's a few that are doing it. We actually went and did a little tour as a team a couple of weeks ago and checked out some of the split level work that some of the more volume builders are doing. So they're certainly moving with that space and they're fabulous. But that's what it requires these days to be made more responsive. I think it also starts to move you out of probably that first home buyer market simply because it's more bespoke. What we're finding now in the growth areas as well as these sort of infill areas is they're the hardest ones, right? They've been left to the last, but that's where we're at now. So these are going to be really big challenges, and we've been working with a couple of councils and a couple of clients about how we actually approach that. And there's councils are way more savvy about this stuff than they used to be. They don't want to see a 3 metre high retaining wall. They want you to work it out. It requires a really good landscaping response as well. So these are all, again, design things that we can all work with. There's some really good parameters out there and some really good work that people are doing on the ground that you can go and look at as well, which is really encouraging.
Yeah, very cool. All right. And so how about activity centres? So within large master plan subdivisions, what do you see that actually makes it successful?
Yeah, I love activity centres in these areas. So the growth areas kind of have a different hierarchy of activity centres. So they have a major activity centre, often built around, hopefully, some public transport, and then you've got your local activity centres as well, or your neighbourhood activity centres. So things, and this is where I really do like to draw on some of those New York experiences that come back to me, right? And this is what's built into basic planning principles. Walkable catchments, street-oriented development, a mix of uses that spreads across the day. They have a civic heart. They have a gathering place where you can go and hang out that has shade and it has seating as well. We're talking about things that are at human scale as well. So really kind of simple ideas, but probably historically we've tended to build car-oriented developments. They're often internalised, and yet they all have their role. They're everywhere. But I think going forward, you certainly see the planning processes set up to deliver alternatives to that design. We're working on a couple of projects in some growth areas at the minute, and councils are really holding you to a pretty high bar. And I think these are really good things. They're talking about how literally think about how we walk from the train station to that space. Think about how the car parking is sitting within that space, locating those uses to make the most of it. Where is the community going to gather? And I think the issue then becomes the actual timing of that delivery of that space. These are generally really big developments that don't go until really quite late in a project. They need the people to come, right? It makes sense. It would be so much better if we could bring them forward earlier, but unless state government are going to do it, I don't know how does the market respond to that? I think that's really hard. Maybe an incremental type approach.
Yeah, cool.
Could work. And also some of the work that we are working on at the moment sort of takes it as, okay, initially we could build this smaller part, but how do we future-proof that to continue to grow it and develop it as the catchment grows? So I think we're getting a lot smarter at it, and I'm really hopeful in the future that we see some really great spaces that we can all walk or ride, whatever, and maybe drive. Everyone can drive as well. We're not,
And good detail to seating, right?
Yeah, that's right. So, yeah, activity centres are going to be critical, particularly as, as for any big growing city that you started out with the amount of population growth going through Melbourne, we can't all drive into the city. So the employment aspect of growth areas becomes vital as well. And it's probably something that's lagged a little bit behind the residential. So I think we'll see a lot more movement in that sort of employment space over the next few years as that catches up. Again, as catchments grow and the nexus is there as well.
Yeah, it's all the chicken and egg kind of stuff.
Yeah,
like
it
comes
is a
and
little
how
bit.
it works.
That's right. And I'm not sure, the market at the end of the day is there for a reason, and it's not going to preemptively jump in. It's a bit naive to think that that's going to happen.
Of course.
That's just where probably state and local government they can step in earlier. There's some good examples I've seen recently in the Western Growth Corridor where councils are starting to build that community infrastructure earlier rather than waiting. And I think that's really positive. Things like aquatic centres, things like open space sports reserves. So actually bringing them on much earlier, which from a community perspective is fabulous.
Yeah. What about schools?
Schools, sometimes they come down to state government. You'll see some schools jumping in early. The particular project I'm thinking has got all three of those. So the school is coming in pretty early. It's got active open space, so the sports reserve is going to be fabulous, and it has a whole aquatic centre sitting across the road that the council is managing. So yes, there are houses and communities already there, but only very recent. So all they need now is the activity centre.
Interesting. So last question. When it comes to, again, large-scale developments, I've seen a number of them implement wetlands or some kind of canals, Point Cook, Sanctuary Lakes, those kind of projects. Do you see much of that happening at the moment, and are they successful at bringing that in?
Yeah, funnily enough, a colleague of mine was showing me some photos of Diggers Rest, which probably historically has not been. It's sort of located a little bit further, it's still within Melbourne growth area, but they've actually just been doing some of this type of development. And the way he described it initially was they're doing canals in Diggers Rest, and I must admit I was pretty dubious. He showed me the photos, fabulous. Really great in terms of basically using the existing drainage pattern, the existing, waterways and the like, and actually creating them as your centrepiece to your development. Quite different to how Sanctuary Lakes and Point Cook will look now. That's probably aging a little bit now. You've got your 20 to 30 year mark, and it was probably a little more still a constructed system. Whereas we're much more seeing now, and this is particularly coming through Melbourne Water and their drainage services schemes and their requirements to go, we have natural waterways. We're going to utilise those. We're going to make sure that there's sufficient room for the water, for the flooding, whatever happens there. We're going to build in our climate change resiliencies into that as well. But we're also going to add that, and we're going to have those as actually open spaces. So you're really then beginning to see that connection. You're going to have then the probably fairly obvious design response of having streets along either side and your housing fronting on, or even housing directly fronting on. The amenity of those spaces, fabulous. We recently went through some work that was done probably 15 years ago, and you can really start to see how those actual landscapes have evolved. The trees are big. The amenity is fabulous. They're really great connected spaces. So this is the work that you see in growth areas now. Fabulous in terms of a family or just anybody. Walking, connectedness. So, I think, yes, is the answer to your question. They're just doing it slightly differently now, which is probably a good thing too.
Yeah, that's excellent. Look, really, really interesting. And I love all these different aspects to planning and how they're changing things going forward. So, look, Shannon, thanks again. Really appreciate you coming on and sharing your story. And so to everyone listening, this is the Land Pioneers podcast, bringing you real conversations with people shaping the future of land and development. And if you got value from today's episode, don't forget to rate, share, and hit subscribe. And we'll see you in the next one. Thanks again.